What's going on? Welcome to episode 26 of the Hike.files podcast, when the best help is just leaving it alone. I'm your host, Kurt Zitzelman, and what I want to talk to you about this week is something that happened to me yesterday, but I've had similar situations in the past. And what I'm talking about is wildlife, and when you should and shouldn't interfere. I guess technically the correct answer is you should never interfere and just let nature take its course. But I suppose if you are out and about and you see a deer or a fox or whatever, some kind of animal stuck in a fence or trapped in some way, and you try to free it, I guess that's acceptable. I mean, to me, that would seem acceptable, especially if it's stuck in something man-made. Man made the problem. Maybe it's man's job to fix it. But what do you do when it's not, or you can't determine whether the issue is because of man, because of humans, human interaction? So yesterday, I was out for a walk on the local rail trail. Now, the podcast will go out on Friday, so this would have been on Tuesday. And I was walking along, and it goes along the Lackawanna River. It's a gravel path in this part of the trail, and just minding my business, just getting out for a quick walk while we had some nice weather. And as I'm walking, I hear to my left, between myself and the river, a fairly loud crunch. And there are some resident deers in that little park. Some resident deer in that little park. And I looked over because quite often you'll see them, and they're not too skittish anymore. They're used to people going by on this trail. And it's not like a zoo or anything. They're wild deer, but they're just used to people. And I see a doe. And it's kind of unusual for a deer to be that loud. So I kind of look, and she takes another step forward, and she's obviously limping. So I stop, and I kind of look up and down the trail, and there's nobody coming. There's a few people way down the direction I came from, and there's one woman up the direction I'm headed with a small dog, but she kind of sees me stop and look, and she's just biding her time. She's not getting any closer. And so I'm watching this doe, and she's slowly inching forward, and she's definitely limping. And she knows I'm there. She knows I see her. She's very well aware, but she's not panicked. She's not bothered by me being there. So I'm kind of the mind, I'm going to make sure no one comes by too quickly and spooks her. And I want to see why she's limping. So I'm watching her as she's moving forward, and she's eating as she's going. So that's a good sign. And she's trying to put weight on her left rear leg, and she's just kind of not able to put full weight on it. So she comes up to the little embankment, walks right out in front of me, maybe 10 feet away, keeping an eye on me the whole time, but seemingly understanding that I'm not going to hurt her. And I watch her as she walks by, and it doesn't appear the leg's broken. There's nothing wrapped around it. She's not bleeding. She just appears to have sprained her ankle. I let her walk by. She gets off the trail and goes into the woods on the other side. All right, off she goes. In my mind, I'm thinking, should I call the game commission? And I decide against it. I turn, and I start walking, and that woman starts walking towards me. She has a small dog. And she stops, and she goes, should we call somebody? She's like, should we call game commission? I'm like, I thought about it. I'm like, but here's what I noticed. She wasn't limping. She wasn't bleeding. Didn't appear to be broken. She was eating, and she wasn't acting odd. She wasn't really skittish. She wasn't really aggressive. She knew she was hurt. She wanted to get across the trail and realized I wasn't going to approach her. We kind of talked for a moment, and we both decided she's probably fine. And the woman I spoke to said, every once in a while we all fall down, which is pretty true. As I walked away, I start to think about that. And there's a good chance that if I would have called a game commission, they would have asked me the very questions that I was observing. Was she bleeding? Was she, appear to be a broken foot or a broken leg or anything? And they probably would have said, nothing we can do. Because ultimately, the best way to help that deer is to let her heal herself. Now, on top of that, she could have fawns relying on her that we don't see. There could be all kinds of things that she could have fawns nearby that we don't see. They could be bedded down. And if we wind up getting her help, quote unquote, those fawns may be left on their own. And then what's the worst thing that happens there? Those fawns may be left on their own. And then was that really helping? Now, in situations like that, I always go back to my mid-20s. I was living on my family property. We had a large, it was like 70 acres at that point. We'd sold some off. It was maybe 65 acres, maybe a little bit over. And I was working with my brother, and I was waiting for him to show up. We used to paint houses, and I was waiting for him to come pick me up. So I went for a walk on the property, and we had some trails. There were some old farm roads on the property, and we just used those to walk around on. And as I came out of the woods into an old field or meadow that the road had kind of grown over, it was all high grass, I almost stepped on a little fawn. And it didn't move, and it just kind of sat there and looked at me. And I looked around, and I was like, okay, Mama's around somewhere. I just left the area, walked somewhere else, and then went back home. Went back next morning just to check, and the fawn was still there. I thought, all right, that's 2 days in a row. I left and went home, and I called the game commission, and I said, listen, I've got a fawn on my property that's been there for at least 2 days. What do we do? And the game commissioner, the game warden, the employee I spoke to, said, go back tomorrow, and if the fawn's still there, call us back. Don't touch the fawn. Don't move the fawn. Don't feed the fawn. Chances are Mama's around nearby. She's seen you twice. She knows that you know the fawn's there. And if you try to touch her, she's going to charge you. But usually 3 days would be unusual. So if the deer's still there, call us back. If not, call us back. Just let us know what happens. So I said, okay. So the next day, I walked down to that old spot, and the fawn was gone. Deer, especially, they have a built-in instinct when they're young, when they're fawns, to stay put. I've seen videos online of people finding deer in that situation, and they think, oh, this fawn has been abandoned. I must help it. As humans, we are great at adding human logic and emotions and thoughts to non-human things, including animals, and we shouldn't do that. The animal world is more than capable of taking care of itself. And as bad as it sounds sometimes, we can't control it. And sometimes the bad thing happens. When I was really, really young, we had a doe that got hit by a car right down the road from our house. My father found the fawn sitting on the side of the road, waiting for its mama to get up. Knowing that wasn't going to happen, my dad scooped up the little deer, brought it back to the house. We didn't keep it in the house. There was actually an old barn on our property, and we raised a deer. We just would feed it. We would make sure it was okay. I think we took it to the vet. I don't remember. It was a buck. As kids, we named it Bucky, of course. And when it was big enough, we would just leave the barn door open. And we assumed when the deer was ready to go out on its own, it would just go out on its own. And it did. And it went off, and it did its deer things. But it would occasionally come back and visit us because it knew we were no threat to it. Around hunting season, though, my father would take the deer, put it in the barn, and close the door because that deer would literally walk right up to a hunter in the woods, no questions, because it was accustomed to people. And people in the neighborhood knew the deer and knew if a buck walks up to you, it's probably Bucky. And they knew not to shoot it, but you never know who's going to be in the woods. So every year, my dad would do this. And then one year, as he's taking the deer in the barn, a neighbor drives by and sees it. Instead of minding her own business, she calls the game commission. They come over and they say, you got to let that deer go. And my dad tries to explain the situation. And they said, there's nothing that you can do about that. If you don't open that door, we're going to fine you. And my dad said, well, can I at least paint his antlers so that people know it's Bucky, that's this deer, or maybe it'll ruin the antlers and nobody will want to shoot it because of that. At least it'll make them think twice before they pull the trigger. And the game commissioner, I guess he agreed. I don't know if he agreed or if my dad just waited for him to drive away and he just got the deer again and painted his antlers, but he spray painted the deer's antlers. And unfortunately, the deer walked right up to a hunter. Hunter pulled the trigger. And I remember finding out when I was a kid, it wasn't, it was sad, but we knew that was a possibility. And in the grand scheme of things, that deer would have died years before if we didn't take it in and try to protect it. But ultimately, we did more damage than we did good. Because that deer may have survived on its own if we would have left it be, and it would have had its natural instinct to avoid humans. And instead, we gave it that lack of fear, and that was ultimately its demise. Now, I don't believe that we really did anything wrong. We did what we should have done. We did what was right. I mean, you don't want to see something, especially a young deer, a fawn, you don't want to see it get eaten by a coyote or run over by a car. You don't want to see that. So you're going to do what you think is right. In the moment, we believe that was right, and it played out the way it did. That, to me, has always been a driving factor in my sometimes hesitant role of walking away and leaving the wildlife be. Because you're not always helping. You see this in national parks out west, where people think, oh, there's, I'm in this park and there's this elk or moose or a bison or whatever. And they think, oh, I'm in a national park, so it must be tame. And then they wind up getting injured. Or the animal gets so used to people that it loses its fear and then it needs to be put down. That is the absolute worst outcome. Admire wildlife from afar. If it really does seem like it is the last resort, and you think you can do so without too much of an impression being put on that animal that people are always going to be there to save or people are always going to be friendly towards it, then okay, it's still not technically the right thing to do, but it's more understandable. But if it's just a deer limping, it could, chances are it's sprained its ankle. Pennsylvania is very rocky. And if the deer tried to cross the river, it may have tried to cross on the bridge, which it probably didn't have good footing on because it's a footbridge for people wearing shoes, not deer with hooves. It may have just slipped. But I looked and I made sure it wasn't bleeding, it wasn't cut. It was trying to put weight on its foot. And if it was broken and it was that painful, it would have held that foot up and it would have just kind of hopped along on three legs. Can I be 100% sure of that? No. But can I also be 100% sure that it wasn't a mother going to its fawns? No. And the outcome of that could have been far worse than a deer with a janky foot. And that's all I got for this week. I hope you guys enjoyed it. And let me know if you're watching this on YouTube. Leave a comment. Have you come across an animal where you really wanted to step in, but you kind of knew you shouldn't? Let me know in the comments. Or if you're listening to this on Spotify, you can leave a voice message. Otherwise, you can contact me at hike.files@gmail.com. Let me know your story, and I'd love to relay it to all the listeners. Thanks for listening. Hope you guys have a great rest of your week. I'll see you in the next.